of poets. Just to provide a little context for the talks of my illustrious colleagues here, whom I will introduce one by one as they get up to talk. About the same time that the Beatles were meeting in Liverpool, Ron Padgett, Ted Berrigan, Joe Brainerd, and Dick Gallup, aka the Tulsa School, met in Tulsa. Let's see if I've got that. There we go. Met in Tulsa in the late 1950s and remained lifelong friends and correspondents. Ted died in 1983, Joe in 1994, and Ron and Dick are still best friends who write, email, and call each other regularly. It is this sustained closeness that marks these four as a school. They not only shared common aesthetic, political, and ethical values, they were truly best friends who sustained and challenged each other through anonymity, tough times, and even the throes of disease and death. Ron is the common denominator of the group. Anyone know Ron Padgett here in the audience? There's always somebody who maybe grew up with him here. He was next door neighbors with Dick, kindergarten classmates with Joe, and rivals with Ted. In many ways, the artistic tension between Ron and Ted was what drove the group to reach the heights they did. By the way, these are Ron Padgett's personal photos, so thank you to Ron for allowing me to use them. Dick Gallup is a year older than Ron, but they lived across the street from each other and became best friends after Dick moved to Tulsa from Greenfield, Massachusetts in 1950. Dick was the George Harrison of the group. Quiet, shy, spiritual. His most famous book, Bingo, was published in 1966 with a cover by Joe Brainerd. He now lives in San Francisco where he drives a taxi and still writes poems. Joe Brainerd is the Ringo of the Tulsa School. Awkward, struggling with his sexuality in a very conservative city of the 1950s, Tulsa, Joe was soft-spoken. He gained early renown for his visual art, introduced Ron to all of the beatnik artists in Tulsa, and eventually in New York became the most popular of the four. There he began doing pop art and created what I think is his finest work, the Nancy series. As Ron tells it, it was Joe's gayness that was their ticket into the parties and high social life of the New York school art scene. Joe was also a writer, and his famous long poem, I Remember, has become an inspirational American classic. Ron you might consider the Paul of the Fab Four poets. Multi-instrumental genius with a regularly recognizable voice. He published, translated, and edited dozens of books of poems, and has likewise been translated into many languages. Recently, he was awarded the Frost Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Poetry, and his life has inspired the film Patterson, directed by Jim Jarmusch. If you have not seen Patterson, I highly recommend it. Ron's childhood was a little out of the ordinary because his dad, Wayne Padgett, was a famous bootlegger. I don't know if you know, but Oklahoma preserved Prohibition until 1959, and somebody had to run hard liquor from the Missouri state line to Tulsa. Ron tells this story of in his fascinating biography of his swashbuckling father, titled Oklahoma Tough. Ron spent most of his youth a block away from TU in this little Cape Cod house. As a teenager, he worked at Lewis Meyer's bookstore in Tulsa, where Lewis introduced him to the little magazine scene by carrying copies of the Evergreen Review, Paris Review, and other avant-garde journals that spurred Ron's imagination and interest in those periodicals. He subscribed to all the magazines advertised in the back of the Evergreen Review, like Leroy Jones's Eugen. It was at the bookstore as well where Ron first met Ted Berrigan, the obvious John Lennon and self-proclaimed leader of the group. Ted was a college student and Korean War veteran who must have made for a 16-year-old Ron a striking romantic and bohemian figure in his combat boots, low-slung dungarees, and Marlboro Reds. With Ted on that fateful bookstore visit was his girlfriend, Pat Mitchell, who would later become Ron's wife and is still married to him. During that meeting, Ted discovered the little cardboard submission box that Ron had placed on the bookstore counter for submission to his new literary magazine, the White Dove Review, whose name was inspired by a 1958 edition of the Evergreen Review. A few days later, Ron found 2 poems from Ted in the little box, asking that they be included in the cool new little mag. On behalf of this high school literary magazine, Ron precociously wrote to many of the beat luminaries whose work lined the pages of the latest literary journals. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Leroy Jones, Dawson Fielding, Robert Creeley, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and even E.E. Cummings, who snidely demurred because he didn't want his work next to that beatnik rubbish. So here was Jack Kerouac's response to 17-year-old Ron Padgett's query for a poem. He sent this one, The Thrashing Doves, and you can see the note. Send me a copy of your mag, same address. Have a good magazine. Let's see. I have a few others. There's, on the left is the letter from Leroy Jones. He was very generous and sort of gave him advice on how to run a magazine. And on the right is the postcard he received from Ginsberg, right? This is just out of the blue to this teenage kid. And they were so generous and encouraging. And here's the E.E. Cummings response that I was mentioning. Uncoin. That's so E.E. Cummings. It was also Ron who printed Kerouac's first submission, Wings of the Dove, but rejected his second. I mean, imagine. This 18-year-old now, rejecting Jack Kerouac's submission. It wasn't good enough for the White Dove Review. In a 1968 Paris Review interview, Kerouac recalls the rejection and exclaimed, "Screw Ron Padgett." In a 2010 interview we recorded in Oklahoma, he called this a slightly arrogant thing to do. While in 1959, the editors of the White Dove Review, Ron Padgett, Dick Gallup, Joe Brainerd, and Michael Marsh, couldn't have known how important their little magazine was going to become, they aspired to gather together what they saw as great, or at least worthwhile writing and visual art from Oklahoma and beyond. And it's this reaching beyond to connect Oklahoma with the rest of the world that makes the White Dove Review such an amazing accomplishment. 4 Tulsa Central High School students, all of 16 and 17, wrote out of the blue to some of their favorite writers and artists and solicited their work. It's only incidental that these artists happen to be and would become some of the most famous avant-garde artists in the world. The White Dove Review has had a lasting impact as well. Because of the White Dove Review, beat poet Allen Ginsberg made Tulsa a vertice in what he called the Wichita Vortex Sutra. It's an amazing poem if you haven't read it. According to his 1977 interview with Jim Edwards, first printed in TU's newspaper, The Collegian, and recently reprinted in an issue of This Land, Ginsberg identifies a triangle of inspiration in the middle of America that included Lawrence, Wichita, and Tulsa at its corners. Writers like William Burroughs, Woody Guthrie, Ted Berrigan, and Ron Padgett, according to Ginsberg, introduced an all-American boy vernacular into high prose and avant-garde poetry. But influence or fame is not what makes the White Dove Review important. Instead, it is the reciprocal belief in the power of community and collaboration. In the avant-garde world, the White Dove proves teenagers can find submission, sympathy, and support. Such community was there just for the asking, and these 4 precocious Tulsa teenagers asked for it, and boy did they ever get it. Because of the White Dove Review, the editors had an immediate entry into the history-making world of New York's most famous forward-thinking and literary scenes. When Ron Padgett and Joe Brainerd graduated from Central High, the White Dove ended, and they all left Tulsa. Ron had gotten a scholarship to Columbia, while Joe was to start at the Dayton Art Institute. He only lasted a semester before he quit to join Ron in his bohemian life in Manhattan. Dick soon quit his studies at Tulane the next year to go to New York, and Ted, who had graduated with his BA in English from TU and almost completed his master's, followed up the rear and reunited with the whole gang in the Big Apple. A funny side note is Ted's apocryphal story of how when he graduated from TU with his master's in English, he wrote on the diploma with a flourish, "I am the master of no art," and sent it back. The problem is, according to the registrar at the University of Tulsa, he never graduated with his MA. Fran Ringgold, poet and wife of Ted's thesis advisor, Manly Johnson, says that somewhere in all her papers there is a draft of Ted's thesis on heroism in the plays of George Bernard Shaw, but she says she hasn't found it yet. History waits. Why did these 4 artists feel they had to migrate to New York City? Surely part of the reason was dislocation. They did not feel they belonged in Tulsa because Tulsa could not contain the aesthetic ideals of these 4 kids. In the 1950s and early 60s, it was a conservative, very homogeneous and segregated place, and still is to a large extent, we all know, which must have felt suffocating to artists longing for a wider world. In New York, they found kin and kind. When Ron and Joe got off the bus at Penn Station, the first person they called was Allen Ginsberg. He met them at a bar, got them set up with lodgings, and introduced them to all his friends. Finally, I come to the story of how they received their moniker. As Ron tells it in his biography of Joe called Joe, the 4 were part of a poetry reading at Red Groom's loft, or Kenward Elmsley's apartment at 28.5 Cornelia Street, Lower West Side of New York City, 1968. He's unsure where the party was exactly. Either way, Kenward is throwing a party for the release of the anthology Young Writers, and in attendance were the likes of John Ashbery, Ruth Klingman, and Andy Warhol. When it came time for one of the 4 Tulsa kids to read, Ashley introduced them as the soi-disant Tulsa School, the so-called Tulsa School, and it stuck. Why did they find such warm welcome in New York, even though they came from the sticks of the southern U.S. city, Tulsa? Because these New York artists were making their own culture, just as Ron Padgett, Joe Brainerd, Dick Gallup, and Ted Berrigan had been doing in Tulsa. This do-it-yourself mentality is at the heart of both these Tulsa and New York worlds, and it continued to guide both worlds for decades to come. What becomes important then is the artistic community, the lifelong relationship between these 4. In this community, one finds the truest commitment to an aesthetic and to a lifestyle that becomes what is ignored, strange, or new. All 4 in the Tulsa School continued to live, work, and collaborate together for decades to come, publishing more magazines together like C Journal, along with books, anthologies, and other works of art. Their relationship with each other, along with the works they produced, would influence many artists and writers in the generations that would follow, and that influence can still be felt today. I wanted to just quickly, before I introduce the first speaker, just show you some highlights of what Mark Carlson was talking about, what we have in our special collections at the University of Tulsa. And one of them, Lewis might be talking about it, is the Day After Christmas Armchair Wanderings book. It's a one-of-a-kind collage piece that Ted made for his wife, poet Alice Notley, which is incredible. But you see pictured here our edition of the White Dove Review that's signed by 9 of the contributors with the note here, AG, arrow. That's Allen Ginsberg did a couple of little doodles in the book, so it's amazing. Please go to the special collections on campus and take a look. It's really stunning. Okay, I'm now going to introduce the first speaker. Olivier Broussard is a faculty member of l'Université Paris-Est, Marne-la-Vallée, and will talk about what he calls Ron Padgett's Poetics of Drift. Olivier knows Padgett's poetry very well, as he has recently translated 2 books of Padgett's into French. He's also translated books by many other New York School luminaries, including John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara, along with work by several other important poets of the American avant-garde. He is also renowned across Europe as one of the organizers of the biannual Poets and Critics Symposium, which brings interested parties from all over the world to Paris to talk about innovative American poetry. Last July, the focus of the symposium was Ron Padgett, and I had the pleasure of being there. Please help me welcome Olivier Broussard.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Grant. Let me just time this. I would like to thank Professors Grant Jenkins and Natalie Panther and Brian Osmer and all the colleagues at the University of Tulsa and at the museum for inviting me to give a talk on poet Ron Padgett. It's a pleasure to be in Tulsa for the first time and an honor to speak among such distinguished colleagues. And Yes, I might move quite quickly at the beginning because my talk was slightly on the longer side, but I was really interested in the presentation of the symposium, in the words of Brian Osmer, and in the idea of migration being a hot topic in public discourse today. And the name of poet Ron Padgett may not come to mind immediately as the subject for a talk at a conference on migrations and displacement. Born in 1942, a former Tulsa resident, Ron Padgett is a poet associated, as Grant just said it, with the Tulsa and New York schools of poetry. His poems, essays, or memoirs do not openly address the issues of migrations as they are understood thematically in public discourse today. Although rereading his collected works for this, I read a poem which I did not know, or called Radio, in which he talks about the race riots in Tulsa, and it's an amazing, I guess you could say, conceptual piece. It's really a great poem. What struck me when I saw the address of the research center and museum where we are assembled today was the variety of names. Although I suppose I might be told that I'm speaking out of European naivety, the melting pot hardly being breaking news here. But what I was interested in is the names themselves speaking migrations. And what I'm going to try to do today is to talk about a poetics of names, or names as markers of migrations and language as migration. And, you know, Gilcrease from Scots, Irish, French, and Creek Indian ancestry, the Helmerich family from Swiss German ancestry, and Tulsa and Oklahoma. I won't tell you because you know better than I do. But I was interested in that mix. Similarly, when Ron Padgett writes a long poem entitled Wilson 57, in which he goes through the pages of his high school yearbook, the names of his schoolmates spell migrations, even if most of his friends were several generations away from displacement. I could speak metaphorically of Ron Padgett's own migrations, of his move to New York with a few of his Tulsa friends to study at Columbia with Kenneth Koch. I could also talk of his year abroad in France as a Fulbright, of his life in Paris, or of his other travels, Italy, namely. One of the first dislocations in his life took place when he edited and published the White Dove Review as a high school student. And to some extent, Ron Padgett dislocated others before relocating himself. I want to bear in mind the history and sound of names and nouns and words in writing, and I would like to look at migrations and dislocations in the very act of writing itself. At its best, poetry is by definition migration, that is to say, the act of moving from one place to another, the process of changing position. In relation to Ron Padgett's work, I'd like to define poetry as the permanent displacement of language, a form of language which cannot stand still. And Ron Padgett's Poetics of Drift, as practiced in his 1990 book, The Big Something, and throughout his oeuvre, is an example of this conception of poetry. And by that I mean the semantic, formal, and logical drifting of words and lines in the poem. I could be told that to read poetry as movement is to take migration metaphorically, when hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced by wars and epidemics throughout the world. I would insist that poetry takes the displacement of language literally, as the history and geography of words and names attest. Poetry is the literal migration of words, or the consciousness of the instability of language, the instability of words. The constant comings and goings from literal to metaphorical uses of language in poetry is also an ever-renewed engagement with history and politics. Words are migrants, Ron Padgett tells us in the poem Louisiana Perch. Words are transitory, words are transport, and the history of word displacement is etymology, and poetry is the memory and continuation of this history. And I'll mostly be talking about Ron Padgett's The Big Something, published in 1990, and published in French translation in 2010. When we decided to publish a French critical edition of Ron Padgett's The Big Something a few years ago, Ron sent us a collage by American artist George Neiman. We immediately liked it because Schneeman's work echoed some of the principles of Ron's poetry. The collage stages the cowboy and pin-up's impossibility to hook up. Self-assured and wonderfully balanced, the pin-up interrupts the comic strip narrative and prevents the cowboy from jumping on the train. Suspended in mid-air, the gangster also fails to pull the transparent dress of the beautiful blonde. That's too bad, I guess, but, you know. Her hair seems to turn into the train smoke. The troubling eruption of her body into the comic strip breaks the cause-consequence relation of the cowboy story. And this cover, you could say, is a story of failed displacement. And similarly, in Ron Padgett's poems, one never reaches the place one would have suspected. Ron Padgett's poems also play with juxtapositions, collages, and elements drawn from different contexts. And what is surprising is that the poems work, whereas their elements do not always seem to fit together. Schneeman's collage is about being thrown off balance, finding oneself between two means of transportation, horse and train. The collage freezes the moment before the fall, when everything is suspended. It captures the moment when the character realizes he is above the void. Soon, he's going to be reminded about the laws of gravity, just as in cartoons. And this is also what Ron Padgett's poems do. The reader is kindly invited in, walk through the poem from place to place, from line to line, before realizing that he doesn't know how he got where he is, or before realizing that the traditional codes of sense-making are absent and that he's completely lost. Just like the cowboy on the cover, reading a poem by Ron Padgett is accepting to jump off the horse, to thrust oneself from the beginning of the line to its end, and then to let oneself fall onto the next line, onto the next surprise. The notion of surprise is built into the title of the book, borrowed from Chandler's The Big Sleep. Something is the variable of the title, as if it were the unknown in a poetic equation, the blank which the poet will be able to fill with an object, a person, a memory, a feeling, an idea, you name it. With such a title, anything can make its way into the poem, and this openness of poetry to whatever comes to the poet's mind is the context for the poetic displacement in Padgett's poetry. Kenneth Koch once spoke of Frank O'Hara's feeling, quote, feeling that the silliest idea actually in his head was better than the most profound idea actually in somebody else's head. Likewise, in Padgett's Democracy of Attention, no idea, as silly as it may seem, is unworthy of making its way into the poem. All the less as the poet says that he, I quote, scoops his ideas from the roadside, the mental roadside that runs alongside the mental highway that leads to a mental hospital. And that's from the poem called First Drift. The mental highway is the metaphor Padgett chooses not only for his state of mind when composing the poem, but also for the sequence and unfolding of ideas in the book. Allen Ginsberg used to say, first thought, best thought. With Padgett, you could say first, second, third thoughts, best thoughts, first train of thought, best train. The only danger for the poem is to get stuck in the mental home. The only way to avoid such a fate is for the poem to keep its sequence of words and ideas moving instead of dwelling on them. At a first reading, then, Ron Padgett's poetry seems to record and transcribe the fits of language and of imagination, leading us from one place, word, object, character, to another without due warning. Padgett's poems sometimes give the impression that they have no time for proper introductions of their characters and events to the reader. It's up to the reader to learn how to deal with such verbal speed, nervousness, and excitement. And so the beginning of First Drift reads, "The writing of poems and the living of life seem to require paying hard attention to any and everything and experiencing a kind of mental orgasm." Yikes, do I mean that? The title of this poem hints at Paget's poetic method. First drift is a pun on first draft. No sooner is an idea or word presented on the page that they lead to new ones. The first draft soon becomes a second one, not because he's revising his poem, but because he has primed the poetic pump. The second draft does not imply a return to what was written, but instead a movement forward, a derivation, a form of writing out loud, of rambling on. The first poem of the book, American Cowslip, is a good example of that. As the flower, the cowslip, becomes Daisy the cow, then the poet's grandmother, and after a series of juxtapositions, a star, a flower, a mind. As he warns in the first lines, nothing is the way you think it is going to be. All you have to do is let your thoughts of the flower wander, to freely associate. As he writes in Monsieur Tarzan, there, quote, "There comes a point at which you have to sit back and let things unroll according to their own sweet will." End of quote. The first draft is therefore like a spark, lighting up the poem, writing itself in the, I quote, "the even flow that makes the great nervousness that is your interior settle back into the afternoon shade and just take it all in 1 extra hour." And that's from Extra Star. Ron Paget's poetry always seems to go downstream, turn towards what is to come, descending from one thing to the next, eager to get to the bottom, to be given the lowdown of the poem. In the big something, the big of the title, which stands for Paget's Poetics of Excitement, functions like a projector in which the poet would insert a new slide for each new scene or moment of the poem. Next slide. The shoulder had its own adventure too. It dipped into a soft monkey fur that sank back into the plush leather backseat of a Rolls Royce that went in four directions at once. It was so fine an instrument of travel. Voyage, I think they call it. This passage insists on the instability of the poetic environment. Although Paget says, next slide, we really have the impression that each word, each clause is a next slide. Everything is sliding and moving. Things and beings cannot stay still. It's difficult, however, to predict which way the poem is going to go if, like the Rolls Royce, it drives in all four directions. Transport and travel become poetic values. The slide metaphor is actually quite interesting because it's an interesting way to talk about Paget's Poetics of Drift, as it provides two kinds of spaces. One is the flat plane of the picture to be looked at, and it's intransitive. And the other one is a guiding surface, a channel or a track, and it's transitive. Next slide implies a form of disjunction, which the act of sliding seems to qualify. So one of the questions is how we go from one slide to the other, how we move in Ron Paget's poetry. An answer is hinted at in Monsieur Tarzan, same poem, with a sequence of relative clauses which take the reader down the chute of the poem, as if the reader kept sliding and falling from one line to the next, carried by the relentless flight of the poem. Relative pronouns and relative clauses abound in Ron Paget's poetry, and they are instrumental in allowing the poem to drift away from its main argument or from its starting clause. One sometimes has the impression of reading a charade or of playing the game called Chinese Whispers, which is the title of a book by John Ashbery. Let me see, I have about 6 minutes left, and I'm just going to move forward. My next part, and I'll just sum it up in a few words, I just don't want to rush through the rest of the paper too much. The idea, what happens in displacement also happens in Paget's poetry in the way that he uses grammatical figures like adjectives, nouns, pronouns, metaphors as characters in his work. And you find, for instance, in some poems, grammatical words that are treated on an equal footing with characters such as Woody Woodpecker, Mighty Mouse, Jean-Paul Sartre, etc. And I will just move to the poem, which is called How to Be a Woodpecker, and in which Paget writes, "This paragraph is a verbal checkerboard. It's your move. You jump around the board until my consciousness gradually disappears into yours." Paget invites the reader to participate in the poem, to make clear that the poem is not the mere transcription of something outside of it. The poem is not a window with a view looking onto a scene which would become its subject. The poem is rather an opaque surface on which things are placed and move around. There's no outside of the poem. It's all happening here and now on the page. The poem is a checkerboard. The reader is invited to play his own moves, to jump from square to square, line to line, word to word. The poet's consciousness, which he so generously offers to the reader, is just a set or game of words, not some metaphysical transcendent reality, but what happens to us when we move from one word to another in the reading process. And then I would like to move on to just a remark about, I guess you could call Ron Paget a foreign correspondent, and I'm interested in the idea of corresponding or not corresponding, and obviously of foreignness. At the end of the poem, The Human Being and the Human Nothingness, Paget remembers, I quote, "staring down at the peppercorns on my steak that night at La Coupole, wondering with embarrassment how I could have assumed that steak au poivre could be the same thing as pepper steak," end of quote. Just as the poet calls our attention on the dangers of mimesis, he insists on the idea that perfect matches or correspondences are mere illusions. Nothing is faithful, everything is translated, everything is rewritten, always rewrites itself in language. Even what seems identical changes from one moment to the next. Paget's poetry inhabits the ever-moving space of translation, also understood in its the etymological sense of displacement. When we translate a text, we are saying the same thing and not saying the same thing, since the words used are not the same. The result of a translation is the same but different. Noir is not black. This actual poem is quite amazing. So take film noir. It didn't exist until the French gave it the name. It became film noir, but in English it was neither black film nor dark. Quote, "Who art as black as hell and dark as night." Make up your mind. I have mine. I'm going with just film noir because that's what it is. I say postal scale when I'm in the warm post office with snow on my stocking cap, and I spy through the window a grey postal scale noir. So nothing can ever be identical to anything else or even to itself. What is at stake here is the displacement afforded by translation, the consciousness of the inevitability of displacement, of its necessity, and of the wealth it brings people in some cases. Translation, displacement, poetry, they all give us an extra dimension and space to live in, neither here nor there, but coming and going in between, not a place, a motion, an emotion. And I'll just say a few words to conclude about a poem called Method. It's a poem that was written in the early 2000s, and I'd like to bear in mind three things: similes, lines, and relatives. Similes, and that's the it's the right part of the poem. When Ron Paget writes of the simile, quote, "I am not like the ant, I am like a doorway," he defines his conception of poetic language. Metaphors, images, and similes are unstable in his poetry. A poem which stops moving is a dead poem. No poetic image can pretend to have the final word. Paget's work is at odds with the conception of poetry understood as the essentialist art of similes. Poetic images are not here to provide access to a stable, definitive identity, to reveal a permanent transcendent truth prior to or outside of the poem. Paget's similes constantly call attention to themselves, to the here and now of the poem. This is where it all happens, on the page, not outside, and the page is the momentary space of our mutual encounter, poet-reader, the only space that matters. Lines now, and that would be the you are next in line on the right part. Displacement in Paget's poetry happens vertically, downstream, down the lines of the poem. Paget is a line operator, a poet of the line. As this passage shows, the simple vertical layout of the poem, the fact that it is a stack of lines is enough to change the meaning of words which are being repeated. Paget plays with the meanings of line as a cue, as in to stand in line, and the line of the poem. Doing so, he shows that lines map out a space made of a linear horizontal sequence and a vertical arrangement. A poem is a pile. And what's quite striking is that even in the final passage, when Paget wonders what happens if you don't know what line is and next is, what happens is that things have happened already, and you have moved down the line and the poem. Here again, it's not so much contents that matters as movement. And finally, relatives. And this is the story of the great Chinese actor named Wang Hum. And it starts by, who else would you like to know about? Whom, not who. There actually was a great Chinese actor named Wang Hum who immigrated to the United States in the mid-19th century. I became quite fascinated by that character because for me, he is the connection between between grammar in Paget's poetry and the idea of migration itself. So in Method, the character of the fictional great Chinese actor Wang Hum, who immigrated to the United States, is one of the articulating points between the poetics of relatives and of relating, understood as narrating, and the history of migrations. Paget's poetry is constantly migrating because he's telling us stories. Stories are migrations, subjects, verbs, and objects move forward from one line to the next. The great Chinese actor not only has his last name, a pronoun, a first case of displacement, but whom is the objective case of the pronoun who. One possible interpretation is that Wang Hum is a character whose last name means transitivity, transit. Wang Hum, the character of the immigrant, is not only the subject but also the object of many sentences caught in the migratory flux of syntax and grammar. And I'm just done. Interestingly, the Chinese actor, no, because I'm 3 minutes over time, so the Chinese actor who, I quote, found fame and fortune in the theaters of San Francisco has the ability to detach his head from his body and to split his body in different parts before putting it all back together. And I'd like to read this metaphor of detaching and reattachment as the metaphor for migration, detaching from one place to reattach to another. Wang Hum's body, capable of detachment and reattachment, could be read as a metaphor for Ron Paget's poems. Lines, stanzas, fragments detaching themselves from the main narrative, if there was ever one. But also for poetry as migration. One moves from one line to the next, detaching oneself from what was previously to move towards what is to come. Thank you, and sorry for the...
Greg Kinzer is an associate professor and chair of English at Austin College, a liberal arts college in Sherman, Texas. He earned his Ph.D. from the Poetics program at the University of Buffalo. A poet and scholar, he has written on Joan Retallack, Jacques Wabat, Myung-Mi Kim, Gertrude Stein, and others. His poetry explores issues of science, the body, non-human being, and other strange ontologies. Please welcome Greg Kinzer.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here for this panel. So Grant started us off talking a little bit about the Tulsa School and was talking about the way in which these young poets, really as kids, 16, 17-year-olds, decide to start a little magazine. And then at 18, they up and leave Tulsa and move to New York to become great artists and great writers. And I think about what I was doing when I was 18, and I find that kind of amazing. That migration, though, is imagined, I think, often as one way, as they move from Tulsa, leave, and move to New York. And in my talk today, I want to trouble that a little bit and explore questions of place and location, and explore some ways in which Tulsa remained, I think, a really important part of their artistic and writerly practice. And in doing so, I'm primarily going to focus on Joe Brainerd, but I'll talk about some of the other folks in the school as well. Suddenly, Joe Brainerd was everywhere. Ron Padgett begins his intimate 2004 memoir of his friend. Padgett is speaking here about his first meeting with Joe Brainerd in first grade class at Whittier Elementary in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1948. Quote, "His art decorated the school bulletin boards. He acted in the school play. Between classes, he was chatting in the hall upstairs, and a moment later, he was on the ground floor coming out of the main offices." But everywhere describes Joe Brainerd's enormous and varied artistic output as well. A prolific artist and writer, Brainerd produced thousands of miniature collages, whimsical sketches, smutty cartoons, detailed assemblages, and paintings, as well as extensive contributions to poetry journals, little magazines, and book covers throughout the 1960s and 1970s, including numerous collaborations with other writers and artists. Indeed, Brainerd was everywhere in the literary and artistic scene of the second-generation New York school, a collection of writers and artists that included Padgett, Gallup, and Berrigan, associated with Tulsa, as well as figures such as Anne Waldman, Joseph Travlo, Bill Berkson, and Bernadette Mayer. But Brainerd was also everywhere geographically, too. Place, physical space, objects, and the ephemera of daily life inhabit his writings with a life and vibrancy that is central to understanding Brainerd's work. And it is this question of place and physicality in Brainerd's writing that I want to explore today. So in the fall of 1960, at age 18, they took the plunge and rushed to New York City. Padgett was going to study at Columbia University, while Joe Brainerd first moved to Dayton, Ohio to accept a scholarship at the Dayton Institute of Design, only to drop out 2 months later, offering the school the invented excuse that his perfectly healthy father was dying of cancer so as not to hurt their feelings, and then moved into a storefront apartment at 210 East 6th Street in New York, where he was later joined by Berrigan. And Padgett describes their arrival thus: "The ride now is a blur, but I do recall our first glimpse of Manhattan just before we curved into the descent to the Lincoln Tunnel. For a moment it sat there in the distance beyond the glittering Hudson like an immense, smoking intergalactic battleship, New York City. And soon these upstart poets from Tulsa found themselves standing on a corner in Greenwich Village. We looked around, a Whelan's drugstore, a Howard Johnson's restaurant. What is so picturesque about this? We'd imagined thatched roofs. And they had imagined Greenwich Village was, a literal village from Europe in the big city. But Brainerd and other members of the Tulsa school did not simply flee the country for the big city. Brainerd returned to Tulsa in 1961 and 1962 and again in 1965. And from 1965 to 1993, shortly before his death from AIDS-related pneumonia at the age of 52, he spent summers in rural Vermont at the farmhouse of his longtime friend and lover, Kenward Elmsley, along with many other artists and writers of the New York scene. Indeed, these migrations among the urban world of New York City and the rural and small town spaces of Middle America were integral to the New York School writers generally, And importantly, these migrations were not just one way. Rather, small town life permeates and percolates through their entire oeuvre. Brainerd and Gallup had grown up in Tulsa, a place he described to Tim DeLugos in an interview as very new and a very sweet city. And it is. Paget, the son of an infamous Tulsa bootlegger, was born and raised there. Ted Berrigan, the other member of the Tulsa School, was born in Providence, Rhode Island, but it was based in Tulsa after the war and went to college on the GI Bill here at the University of Tulsa. Frank O'Hara, the garrulous leader of the New York School, grew up in small-town Massachusetts, and John Ashbery was raised on a farm near Lake Ontario. Given how important the small town, the rural, and the natural was to the poets and writers of the New York School, the scholar Timothy Gray goes so far as to argue that for all the group's avant-garde technique and celebration of energies and opportunities and sexual tolerance of city life, that there is a pastoral impulse in the New York School that marks them out as secret nature writers. One concrete example of this pastoral impulse can be seen in Dick Gallup's poem, The Georgics, which opens this way. On Saturday afternoon in Georgia, I had nothing to do, so I sent myself back to Georgia underwater in the traditional manner of the English Renaissance. Could I maybe conk you out some poems, huh? The highly polished poems of the English Renaissance daunt me with their Latin tongues. And here maybe I should take a moment to say that the pastoral is one of our earliest poetic forms. It usually features shepherds out in some idealized rural setting, but a key feature of the pastoral too is those shepherds are often really from the city, who are kind of wearing the masks of shepherds and looking back at city life. And here, Gallup doubly ironizes his Sunday afternoon in Georgia with a complex and playful jab at the high-minded poetic tradition of the pastoral that he simultaneously invokes and repudiates. For Brainerd, we can see his poetic and artistic practice circulating among at least 3 distinct locations: Tulsa, New York City, and rural Vermont. Each of these locations is a place that informs his artistic output and, just as importantly, transforms it. Brainerd's early prose piece titled Back to Tulsa Again explores just these dislocations and migrations explicitly. With an exuberance and earnestness typical of his style, Brainerd describes one of the road trips back to Oklahoma with Ron Paget, Ron's father, Pat Mitchell, and himself. The trip back was as normal as possible, considering John Wayne drove in $80 cowboy boots, and we, the 3 Tulsans in New York, were his passengers. Yes, even Ron was a passenger, as I am now a guest in my own home. In my own home, I am a guest. We 3 passengers made the big move back to Tulsa. We 3, 1 girl and 2 boys, or maybe I should say woman and men. Both embarrass me and seem not quite right. 3 people, a poet, a woman, and a painter. Amidst the charm and deliberate naivete of his writing, we can see Brainerd wrestling with urgent questions of identity, both as an artist and as a man, that are bound up with these 2 very different geographical places and the transit between them. Yes, Ron's father was anxious to get home to Tulsa, he writes. Home to space and lightness, white square gas stations and shining car lots. Ron's father is obviously from Oklahoma. We, Marx Brothers -1, are obviously only flounderers, floundering because we are neither New Yorkers nor Oklahomans. Brainerd is a flounder here, caught somewhere in between, neither a New Yorker nor a Tulsan, but somehow both, and caught too and confused in his own sexual identity, experiencing an uncomfortable sexual awakening as Pat sits in his lap in the car, even as he comes out as gay a few years later. In this in-between space, Brainerd finds himself not absent an identity, but with too many identities. Not a man without a country, he goes on, but a man, or should I say boy, with a country too big. The three of them are variously named guests and passengers, the Three Stooges, the Marx Brothers, and Fuckadoos. Their identities are unhoused, uncertain, yet also steeped in the knowing irony of comedy, with the Stooges and the Marx Brothers distinctly New York comedy. Following Thomas Gray's idea of the urban pastoral, we can see an element of the pastoral shepherd in Brainerd's play here. Ron, Pat, and Joe are shepherds alternating between the useful disguise so central to the genre and genuine uncertainty as they return to the bucolic land of their youth. Or is the gesture more complex than that? I think it is. Tulsa is everywhere in this mad, looping, and layered retelling of their drive back to Oklahoma, full of the energy of the road. Ron's father is John Wayne in $80 cowboy boots, and Joe wears desert boots. The sky, he writes, is higher in Tulsa than in New York. And later, as he concludes the piece, they all sing Oklahoma together in the car. Oklahoma, we began. O-K-L-A-H-O-M-A, Oklahoma, okay. We ended, we laughed. Ron giggled and I snorted. Pat was choking on a Spanish peanut. But more is going on here than a casual reminiscence about his youthful memories of Tulsa. And Tulsa operates as more than just a pastoral foil to the urban space of New York City. Brainerd's style, both in his writing and in his art, is simple, gentle, and rooted in the personal. John Ashbery writes of his friend, quote, "Joe was one of the nicest artists I have ever known. Nice as a person and nice as an artist." There is a nonchalance and innocence to his art, and I am not the first critic or reader to ask how artful Brainerd's artlessness really is. The ordinary is his artistic preoccupation, and a distinctive feature of his writing is the way the ordinariness of daily life circulates throughout his work. Tulsa, New York, and rural Vermont, all three equally. The portrait of his friends in Back in Tulsa again pairs with Diary August 4th to the 15th and New York City journals, and also with the Vermont Journal and the Vermont Notebook, a book-length collaboration with Ashbery. In the first of the New York diaries, written just months after Back in Tulsa again, he writes in fragmented, playful ways about visits to the Museum of Modern Art and to the Met. Here he worries about the differences between the major and minor in art, categories that can't help but reflect back on the way Brainerd's art insists on its own minorness, which is not to say unimportance. Quote, "Today I thought seriously about Excalibur," which he'd been seeing at the moment, "and decided it could just as easily have been Prince Valiant's or even Flash Gordon's." I kind of love that. "I have definitely decided this to be a minor treasure." But then the next day he writes, "Today I decided that perhaps minor treasures are not so minor after all." And when he ran to the Museum of Modern Art to see the mummified remains of the actual asp that Queen Cleopatra used to kill herself with only just to find out the exhibition had been returned to India. And then, in a redoubling of this theme of loss and absence that begs the question of Brainerd's artlessness, and that echoes Frank O'Hara's iconic poem, "The Day Lady Died," he ends the piece this way on October 15th. "Today, I am truly horribly upset that Marilyn Monroe has died. So I went to a matinee B movie and ate king corn popcorn." In each of these spaces, the New York diaries, the Vermont notebooks, and the spontaneous prose of his return to Tulsa, Brainerd enacts a complex yet unassuming pattern of literary echoes and allusions as he circulates among these three very different geographies. The New York City journals, written in 1971 and 1972, narrate a manic road trip to an art show with Ann Waldman, Michael Brauenstein, Ron, and Pat Pageant, that it becomes a kind of mirror to their road trip back to Tulsa. Personal identity once again is questioned, as in a comment from Ann Waldman, "You're a different person from when I first met you." And home once more becomes uncertain. There it is. New York looks pretty good over there. When I see the city from far away, I like to try to imagine someone I know in the city, in their apartment, doing whatever they might be doing. It's a hard place to believe you live in if, at that moment, you don't. As Brainerd looks back at New York from the outside here, questioning again his identity, we might see this as an inversion of the pastoral order. But my dissatisfaction with reading the Tulsa school in terms of the pastoral is that pastoral space is too idealized at both ends, the country and the city. In Raymond Williams's landmark study, The Country and the City, he reminds us that over time, quote, the country has gathered the idea of a natural way of life, and the city has gathered the idea of an achieved center. The city is a place of noise, worldliness, and ambition. The country as a place of backwardness, ignorance, and limitation. And the tensions of the pastoral are ultimately resolved by a return, either literal or implied, to the city. But Brainerd resists this teleology of the city, and the hierarchy of city over country is not what we see in Brainerd or in the New York school, with the possible exception of Berrigan. Instead, for Brainerd, the specificities of place are always lively, concrete, and real, not idealized. Instead of treating geography and place as a backdrop against which art happens, Brainerd activates the physical things around him, treating the world as intersections of mobile elements, of which he is only one of many participants. If Brainerd and others moved to New York in order to intermingle with diverse cultures, gather in bars and coffee shops and galleries, and take advantage of the sexual tolerances of the city, this was a liberty and a practice of place that they brought back with them into other spaces they inhabited. One small and cheeky example of this takes place at a small roadside cafe outside Joplin, Missouri. Brainerd mulls playfully around the, quote, one bathroom for men and women, so you had to hook the door. And if you were employed there, you had to wash your hands before leaving. That was the law. The sign said so. Not being employed, I took my advantage and took my liberty. A key part of this small moment of advantage taking, to my mind, is the way his experience of this place is intimately bound up with the physical stuff around him. He dwells on how the space of the cafe is small, very small, with a large white sign saying cafe. My eye hit the small 7-Up sign dangling from a string attached to the light fixture. It was used as a pull to turn the lights on. I smiled. I felt good. I ate lunch. I was just I. What Brainerd describes here is a moment of identity. It was just I, but it is a feeling of identity that takes place with and through the physical space and physical things around him. And I think this is important. Throughout Brainerd's art and writing, there is a proliferation of physical stuff of the 1950s and 60s and 70s Americana in all their charming and kitschy specificity. And nowhere do we see his love of physical places and stuff, the alligator purses and cold turkey sandwiches and green dishwashing liquid and number 2 pencils show more than in his long prose poem titled, I Remember. I Remember exists in several versions which he began writing and rewriting in 1969, and it has become a beloved and widely admired classic of the second generation. There is so much going on in I Remember. In its sprawling, anaphoric style, with each line beginning with a performative and incantatory phrase, I remember, Brainerd weaves together meditations on sexuality, religion, family, geography, and the nature of memory itself into this grand, fugue-like structure. But here, I want to draw attention just to the way Tulsa, in all its physical specificity and profusion of objects, inhabits the poem. I remember my first cigarette. It was a Kent in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with Ron Padgett. I remember my first erection. I thought I had some terrible disease or something. I remember the only time I ever saw my mother cry. I was eating apricot pie. I remember the giant gold man taller than most buildings at the Tulsa oil show. I remember in Tulsa a red sidewalk that sparkled. I remember an ice cream parlor in Tulsa that had a thing called a pig's dinner. It was like a very big banana split in a wooden dish made to look like a pig's trough. If you ate it all, they gave you a certificate saying you ate it. I remember the first escalator in Tulsa in a bank. I remember riding up and down it and up and down it. The specificity of place and time in this book is astonishing. And as Jamie James points out, I remember is so deeply a product of its time and place, or rather places. What would a Chinese reader make of I remember, or a contemporary adolescent in Los Angeles? In 100 years, it will require as many footnotes as the letters of Cicero do today. Brainerd remembers corn and sack dresses, box suits, pillbox hats, round cards, squaw dresses, big fat ties with fish on them, ducktails, Cherokee haircuts, a 1949 red Ford convertible, his father's collection of arrowheads, his grandfather who lived on a farm dunking his cornbread in his buttermilk and how heavy the cornbread was, ringworms, name tags, driftwood lamps, bacon and lettuce and tomato sandwiches and iced tea in the summertime, Christmas carols and car lots, bean-bag ashtrays, rick-rack earrings, stools, donuts, and coffee, pasted over prices, rolled down maps, and rubber-tipped wooden stick pointers, Necco wafers, and Polaroids. His prose poem goes on in this way for over 100 pages. What we get here is a profusion of being, human and non-human alike. Objects and animals, food, clothing, and bodies all become co-inhabitants, co-actors in company. Materials become drawn into the foreground as matters of concern, and this concern for materials is integral to Brainerd's artistic practice. Quote, "I got turned on by things and they'd stimulate me," Brainerd said. "I don't ever have an idea the material does it all," he continues in an interview with Anne Waldman. "You have a figure and a flower, and you add a cityscape and it makes the story. You have control if you want to take it, but that's not something I ever wanted to do much." Dick Gallup articulates the same company of being when he writes in his poem, Where I Hang My Hat, quote, "Where I can see the real thing occasionally, a classless integrity of being." With this emphasis on materials, on places and objects and things, comes a particular kind of self-effacement. As much as his poems are intimately personal, there is a way in which Brainerd empties himself of the I so as to let others speak, other people, other friends, other places, and other things. In a letter, he describes his long memoir, I Remember, this way, quote, "I also feel that it is about everybody else as much as it is about me, and that pleases me. I mean, I feel like I am everyone, and that's a nice feeling." This desire to empty himself out in favor of the other voices, other objects, and other materials around him shows also in his playful poem, Little Known Facts About People. Here, he pays tribute to his many friends by relating little-known facts about them, facts that point away from their status as famous poets or artists and toward their more complex trajectories as ordinary people. And we might pair this with Ted Berrigan's poem, People Who Died, which I think functions in a similar way. Where, then, is Joe Brainerd? He is everywhere, as his dear friend Ron Padgett wrote, and also nowhere. His art and writing is not so much about place as of place, and his identity as an artist and writer exists only with the people and objects around him. Paul Auster suggests that Brainerd had, quote, "no ambition other than to depict the visual and sensual thisness of what it feels like to sit in a room and look out the window." And asked whether his art ever had a message, Brainerd said this, "There is one thing. I sort of have the feeling that most people don't take seriously enough that we're animals. That always bothers me. Thank you.
Louis Friedman teaches creative writing at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater and is a poet and scholar who received his Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin. His latest book of poetry from Ugly Duckling Press has a title that reflects the challenging poetry that lies between its covers. It's called Residual Synonyms for the Name of God, in which he improvisationally rewrites a book written by his grandfather. Louis was just awarded a year-long fellowship as writer-in-residence this fall at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Please welcome Louis Friedman.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you, everybody. Just want to make sure how much time I have here. Okay.
You want me to keep you apprised?
Yeah, okay. I will try and be quick. But I don't know how, but I'll try. I have a particular enjoyment that I maybe suspect that no one else shares for the kind of terminology that's produced in academic discourse that feels like for a moment completely semantically insurmountable. You know, as though it could produce a formulation of some uncovering of a world other than the one that I thought that I was reading in. Like critical arcanization, for instance. It's a term I came across while researching the fascinating compositional and interpretive strategies of Jewish Kabbalists in medieval Al-Andalus. It's a term that, so far as I know, is invented and employed solely by Moshe Idel, who's a very eminent scholar of Jewish Kabbalistic texts and professor emeritus at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. What Idel means by the term critical arcanization is to describe a process through which arcane and esoteric textual operations become operative in the literature of a culture in crisis. That textual difficulty can be a necessary way of protecting cultural knowledge at a moment in which the culture is especially vulnerable. So critical arcanization then is the making arcane in a moment of crisis. Idel's argument about how and when the term might be applied to 2 millennia of radical and esoteric hermeneutic approaches in relation to the various forced migrations and dislocations of Jewish diasporic communities is complex and not the subject of this paper, so I'll forgo it. But I would ask you to imagine this, to imagine how in a moment of crisis, some knowledge grows hidden, is encoded within the formal difficulty, written within the unreadability of a text, and its transmission continues and is protected within that structure. So I like the term, the difficult term, critical arcanization, for an imagination of this theory of textual difficulty. I like the homophone I can feel in it by crunching the two words together, a crystallization of critical arcanization, in which a crystalline structure, seemingly fractal and irreducible, develops around whatever it is culturally that we must keep active by writing it and yet not knowing it. As Stéphane Mallarmé, the widely acknowledged secret father of the European poetic avant-garde, famously writes, "Everything sacred and wishing to remain sacred is enveloped in mystery." Mystery, in Mallarmé's formulation, produces a continuity of sacred meaning, allows it to remain sacred by protecting this meaning against the exposure caused by continuity itself. That is, against the repeated form of its appearance. Mystery envelops the movement of the sacred, so the sacred object can always exceed itself, always yield something other than the terms of its encounter. Valences of Idel's theory of critical arcanization will pop up in this talk, but I will never say the term again. But it won't find any rigorous application here in the talk. But the talk itself is going to be about the poetic approaches of Tulsa's mid-century self-adopted son, Ted Berrigan. But I begin with this in order to, I suppose, encourage an openness in your approach towards seemingly arcane or disjunctive poetic texts. to ask you to imagine that our cultures write through us as subjects, and as much as we might feel the promises of our own subjectivities shifting and changing through our writing. And to imagine that when we see aesthetic uses of language that we do not yet understand, that do not, for instance, seem to transparently possess that powerful use of narrative as a tool for control in the work of addressing intergenerational trauma, as Dr. Cromer spoke about yesterday, that when we encounter these seemingly nonsensible texts, to not project onto them an imagination that what one witnesses in these obscurities are the posturings of an individual subject looking to overstate their own difference, but rather to feel in it that what we do not yet understand, written through and by that poet or artist, is the encoding of an essential cultural knowledge that might safeguard its continuity and passage through a moment of vulnerable cultural uncertainty. Not too long before Bob Dylan transformed Rimbaud's drunken boat into a magic swirling ship, as Clinton Halen pointed to in his wonderful talk yesterday afternoon, Ted Berrigan, in the winter of 1962, a mostly unpublished, mostly unemployed 27-year-old poet living in New York City, produced a translation of Rimbaud's visionary voyage poem. It was only 12 years later, in 1974, that this translation was published. The image is up here, which I scanned from the special collections here in Tulsa. It's hard to get a hold of this. Along with drawings made by Berrigan's lifelong close friend and collaborator, Joe Brainerd, who, as has been mentioned already, he met here in Tulsa. And as you'll note by looking at the cover projected above me, the text, I suppose to the upper left of my body, the text is not framed as a translation, but as an original composition by Ted Berrigan, The Drunken Boat Now, an update on Rimbaud's text in homage to Rimbaud. This, at first glance, is a little bit deceiving. Despite or due to Berrigan's relative unfacility with the French language, it's true that it's not entirely accurate to term what emerges here as a translation. Berrigan's text is also, though, not entirely not a translation. It does, after all, faithfully follow the structure and narrative of the 25 quatrains of Rimbaud's poem. You know, after spending quite a lot of time with this in preparation for the talk, I think I'd categorize it as a translation of a translation. Specifically, maybe it's a translation of Luis Varèse's influential translation of The Drunken Boat that was published as a New Directions paperback in 1961. And as a side note, to this side note, I'll mention this talk is only made of side notes. I'm very curious, and if anyone knows something about this, please tell me, whether Varèse's translation of The Drunken Boat was published and circulating prior to that publication in 61, in which it becomes paired with A Season in Hell. Her translation of A Season in Hell had been in circulation since 1945. And the reason I'm curious about this is because of a move that Varèse makes in stanzas 19 to 21 of The Drunken Boat, in which she creates a repetition between the opening lines of each stanza. She says, "Who ridden by violet mists, streaming and free, who spotted with electric crescents ran, who trembling felt behemoths rot," etc. It's a syntactical repetition which is not present in the opening lines of these stanzas in the French, and which immediately, to my ear at least, brings to mind the unmistakable incantatory line opening who's of Allen Ginsberg's 1955 poem Howl that have so lodged themselves within an American poetic idiom, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to terror through the wall. Now, it's no secret, of course, that Rimbaud was extremely significant and formative influence for Ginsberg, but was it through Varèse's translation of The Drunken Boat that the who's of Howl moved through Ginsberg, or was it in thinking of Ginsberg that Varèse updates Rimbaud for the American ear? Either way, Ted Berrigan, who is enamored with Rimbaud via Varèse and enamored with Ginsberg too, in 1962 keeps Varèse's innovation intact in his translation of her translation. This all begs another side question. A question I've wanted to ask publicly many times, which I have no studied answer to. Why did Arthur Rimbaud reappear with quite such force to young, mostly white poets, musicians, and artists of the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? I mean, why did a poet who wrote his last poem at the age of 19 in 1873 in Europe appear so incredibly present and relevant to Allen Ginsberg, to Bob Dylan, to Ted Berrigan, to Jim Morrison, to Patti Smith, to David Wojnarowicz, especially in New York, but across the United States in the 60s and 70s? And there are some obvious answers I could offer for this. The anti-establishment sentiment of Rimbaud, his desire for a new order through disorder, for a transcendent visionary experience, coupled with his total abandonment at such a young age of a literary fame that awaited him for a life of exploration and adventure. The violent romance of Rimbaud and Verlaine as they followed each other across major European cities. It's all a narrative that I can easily imagine echoing with and in a deep longing for those who grew up with the particular violences of the reordering of American cities and American culture in the years after World War II. And we can imagine some of all that, I think, when we look at the juxtaposition of images that Joe Brainerd positions vis-a-vis the first page of Berrigan's text up there. We have sort of a repressive cutout of a woman in a dress standing neatly with arms behind her back. Her hands seemingly get displaced to a cutout right below the stanzas in which she's engaged in some sort of domestic labor. We have the superimposition of a $7.99 price tag upon the product joy. It could all be read without too much strain to ornament the text with an explicitly sort of conservative 50s repressive vibe. I do think in the context of Brainerd's larger corpus, the use of these images is a little more layered and complex than that, but I'll let that side note pass unpassaged. But looking at these images and reading through Berrigan's translation of a translation of The Drunken Boat, I can't help feel the stirrings of another kind of thought on this subject. That is, that it's not only the exoticization of Rimbaud's life and poems by young Americans in the 50s and 60s, it's also Rimbaud's colonial exoticization of America itself in The Drunken Boat, of the Americas in The Drunken Boat, that's present in the century gap of this transaction, as though it were no time at all. The Drunken Boat begins unmistakably in a colonialist's imagination of European exploration of the Americas. Its first stanza sees the boat, which is the poem's protagonist, happily lose its masters to an invisible attack by what it describes clearly as indigenous American savages in a pure projection of a colonialist fantasy. The poem is certainly not on the side of the masters. It delights in their murder, but it is, of course, entirely on the side of the masters in that it traffics in the image of the uncivilized native as a symbolic polarity through which the European mind might leave the ordered sensory regime of civilization and perceive something beyond that. It is not Africa or the Orient, where Rimbaud travels to in his real-life colonial adventure, that's the site of the colonial fantasy for the voyage of the Drunken Boat, but the Americas, a place to which Rimbaud never travels, and a site of European colonial violence, perhaps more amenable to being cast as the pure interior space of visionary experience, precisely because of its repeated status in the European colonial imaginary as a virgin, unpopulated or barely populated space, as an ahistorical world of potential colony and transformation. Something of this in Rimbaud's American imaginary translates, I think, very particularly for young white progressive Americans of that moment. With Rimbaud, they can have it both ways, the violence of a pressure put upon the myth, while retaining the myth itself as a kind of anarchic space of possibility and self-fashioning. Berrigan owns this poem of Rimbaud in precisely such an American way, I think. He even playfully doubles down on some of the American references in the poem in that casual way of his, turning Verez's quite literal translation, I would show children these Dorados into, I'd like to show a child these Eldorados, punning the Floridian swordfish into the deeper colonial European fantasy of a lost city of gold and a Texan town. And in this secret American ownership of the Drunken Boat is, I think, a promise, a missive for Berrigan in his own youthful, intense demand to transform himself and his life. And I intuit that Berrigan's relation to his time in Oklahoma and Tulsa can also be figured in this. Hold on a second, I know we're probably running over. Just trying to think where to cut. Let's so hard when one's made something to figure out what part is not necessary. I only got to where I was going by going there. Hold on a second. Okay, so maybe I'll just try and summarize something really quickly. Don't worry, this slide's not important, that slide. I just want to maybe summarize so that I'll try and speak this out as opposed to talk it through. That Berrigan, when he's translating The Drunken Boat, he's going through a moment of crisis in his own life. He recently has married a woman who's much younger than him and whose parents object very strenuously, and her parents place her in a psych ward as a kind of protest to the marriage and run Berrigan out of the state of Florida with their connections to cops there. And he's in New York writing letters to her while he produces this translation in the winter of 1962 of The Drunken Boat. And he writes a lot of letters to her about the translation as he's producing it. And he does very much, I suppose, imagine this translation in those letters as being a possibility of a kind of self-fashioning for himself, a way to take on the kind of mantle of being a poet in a really totalized way. And I would say also that the colonialist fancy of Rimbaud doesn't entirely get left behind here as well. That living in New York, Berrigan is fashioning himself in some way as someone from Oklahoma, though he's only in Tulsa for 5 years. As David Shapiro, the New York poet who's roughly contemporaneous with Berrigan, describes that, and this is a quote from Shapiro, he says that Berrigan often played the role of a summer savage from Oklahoma and then would speak didactically about his love for Shaw and Whitehead. Shapiro's choice of words here is telling. The Western frontier connotation of Oklahoma in the European-American geographical imaginary, an imagination that's only increased with the huge popularity of cowboy and Western films in the 50s, offers for Berrigan a romanticized refashioning of his working-class East Coast identity. In a world of New York poetry dominated by educational and class privileges, he turns it into a Western identity, with its relation to knowledge wildly operative in the lived body, not held within institutional discipline. Okay. But it's not these kind of narratives of the Drunken Boat and how Berrigan imagines he's self-fashioning himself that actually ends up being the kind of transformation for Berrigan. Instead, it's actually Berrigan's disjunctive permutation of the Drunken Boat when he begins his sonnet series later in 1962. The sonnets is an 88-poem sonnet sequence that uses all kinds of textual techniques, including translation, permutation, and collage to construct sonnet after sonnet after sonnet. It sort of builds a sonnet machine. And so this is the third sonnet of it. Stronger than alcohol, more great than song, deep in whose reeds great elephants decay, I, an island, sail, on my shores toss on a fragrant evening, fraught with sadness, bristling hate. It's true, I weep too much. Dawns break slow kisses on the eyelids of the sea, what other men sometimes have thought they've seen. And since then I've been bathing in the poem, lifting her shadowy flowers up for me, and hurled by hurricanes to a birdless place, the waving flags nor passed by prison ships. Oh, let me be burst and I be lost at sea, and fall on my knees then womanly. And this poem is entirely constructed of lines produced from his translation of The Drunken Boat. And if we trace where those lines come from, we can see that he's reading his methodology in which he's reading through the poem, selecting sort of intuitively a line here, a line there, right, until he gets to the end of the poem, the 25th stanza, and then he starts working backwards through it. Until he gets to around stanza 6, and then he starts working forwards through it again until he gets to the 25th stanza, and then he starts working backwards in it again. And this is a methodology that he uses in other poems as well in the sonnet sequence. And in fact, he recursively applies this methodology to the sonnets themselves, reading sonnets he's already written forwards until they get to the point that he's at, then backwards again, and then forwards again, using the measure of the line to construct the poems. So just skipping over a bunch of things, there's a lot to be said about the way these permutational strategies produce a layering of time, but I also just want to think about very quickly the way they produce a layering of space and place as well. That Berrigan in these sonnets he's constantly referring to Tulsa. He's constantly bringing poems that his friends, Ron Padgett will have a poem that is a failed poem for Ron Padgett, and Ron Padgett will give it to Ted Berrigan, and Ted Berrigan will put it into his functional sonnet machine and make a new sonnet out of it, and then those lines will start to themselves permute in future sonnets. So there's this kind of mechanism in it that's also about displacement and replacement in the mechanism itself, not just the displacement and replacement of lines, but the displacement and replacement of people and places for Berrigan, and especially I would say of Tulsa. Okay, so all this maybe to say in shorthand that when Berrigan actually does publish in 1974 The Drunken Boat with the drawings by Brainerd in them, that there is a kind of truth to him saying that these are his own. Because by that time, the Sonnets has been republished by Grove Press. It's been anthologized in the Norton Anthology of American Literature. When one comes by the line, "Oh, let me burst and be lost at sea," if you're a reader of Berrigan's poetry, the first thing you would think is the Sonnets, and that these lines have been borrowed in for this kind of translation in a way that doesn't quite fit anymore. In a sense that they are Berrigan's. And I'll just finish with one last small poem of Berrigan's that will bring us full circle, about which I have nothing to say. It's called Pinsk After Dark. Reborn a rabbi in Pinsk, reincarnated backward time, I gasped through my beard full of mushroom barley soup. Two rough-faced blonde Cossacks drinking wine paid me no heed, not remembering their futures, Verlaine and Rimbaud.
On this important group of poets and writers. We're going to now break for lunch.